An off-chance encounter as an intern transformed Funmi's life several years later when someone she networked with earlier in her career thought of her down the line and offered her a job. Funmi Oludaiye is now a managing director and global head of engineering at Goldman Sachs. Today, we're going to hear about how she advanced in her STEM career by always putting her best foot forward. I'm your host, Dr. Kathleen McInnes, and this is Smart Women, Smart Power.
This is Smart Women, Smart Power, a podcast that features conversations with some of the world's most powerful women.
Well, welcome, Funmi. We're thrilled to have you here. Thank you for schlepping down to D.C. from New York to making the trek.
It's always lovely to be in D.C. I have such a great time every time I come back.
Well, and it's a bit of a homecoming, right? Because you went to college at Howard?
I did go to college in D.C. Some of my best memorable 4 years. And I have lots of friends still here, so I'm always looking for an excuse to come back.
Oh, true. And you actually caught us, to the audience, obviously this was pre-recorded because the weather today is great.
Gorgeous outside.
Very, very unique. Well, so to get us started today, would love to get your story of how did you get into the field? How did you decide to focus your work, your efforts on the STEM fields?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Nigeria. In a boisterous household. And I was an endlessly curious child. I read a lot as a kid. I probably read every single thing that had print on it in the house. Newspapers, shopping catalogs, my mom's old Reader's Digest magazine. And I also had an affinity for problem solving and tinkering with things. I would play with my, I think it was a Nokia phone back then. And try to dismantle it and see how it worked underneath the hood. I wasn't successful, of course.
Yes, but how old were you when you're taking apart your Nokia?
It had to be my early teens, I think. Okay. And I wasn't successful because I didn't know what I was doing, but that was just the kind of kid I was. Just someone who really wanted to get into the weeds and try to understand how things worked. And I also excelled at a lot of subjects in school. I was a very studious, nerdy, young child, and my father was an engineer, and he was adamant that I had to study something in the sciences. So even though I was really interested in reading and writing, and I thought, at some point I might try to be an author or something, he disavowed me of that idea. I was adamant that I had to study something in the sciences. I considered medicine because my mom was a doctor. She's retired now. But I realized I didn't like biology or chemistry, subjects that required memorization. But I took really well to math and physics because it's more analytical. Once you understand the underlying concept, you can apply the formula to solve multiple problems down the line. So it was almost by a process of elimination. It was like, well, I like math and physics. I don't like biology and chemistry. I think I'm going to do engineering.
Interesting.
And so I settled on electrical engineering as a major. And how I got into programming actually was similarly, I guess you can say almost by accident. When I was a sophomore in college, I took an introduction to programming class. And the goal was really to introduce students to the concept of electronics programming hardware. But it was my first time writing code, and I was so fascinated by the idea of sitting in front of a blank screen and typing up some code and running it and then just seeing the computer do things. So I did really well in that class, had a really great time. And when an opportunity came to apply to a summer internship as a software engineer, I jumped on it. And the rest is history.
Wow. So what's the field like when you were going through and choose? The root of the question I'm really asking is, we hear a lot about gender disparities in STEM fields and how there need to be more women. Did you experience that when you're?
Yeah, I'd say that my experience has been that there's typically, somewhat of or close enough parity in the earlier or more junior levels, entry levels, as far as the gender divide.
Sure.
So it tends to be about 50-50 men and women in the entry-level roles. But as you go over the course of careers, you'll see that there's fewer women in leadership, in engineering leadership, for many different reasons. But that's just been the trend that I've seen. And I think there's a lot of studies that will probably back that up. So
it's a retention issue.
Yeah, I think it's a retention issue. And, there's many different reasons that women either choose to drop out of tech or they move into a different, maybe adjacent function. So, there's many reasons for that. So I felt a lot of that, and it's felt like a lot of responsibility for me as well as I've progressed in my career. When I look around and I'm one of few women in my role or in my title on the floor, I feel so much responsibility, happily, to mentor other more junior women engineers, just to, be a source of representation for them and help women see that they can also ascend to this point in their careers. But it's definitely been a consistent path of my career so far.
Well, and it's almost cliche to say, but the cliches exist for a reason. It's hard to be what you can't see.
That's right. Yeah.
Right.
Yes. And that's why I think mentoring and sponsoring relationships are so important and so valuable. And so and not many people necessarily know how to form those relationships, but I think there's a lot of studies that have shown that women who have successful mentoring relationships tend to stick in their careers or their industries longer because they feel that they have a safe space where they can go and present challenges that they have or things that they're unsure about without feeling judged, and kind of get that support that they need that can maybe potentially help them stick longer in that career.
You used a term just now, mentoring versus sponsorship, and mentoring and sponsorship. For our listeners who aren't necessarily aware of the difference between the two terms, I'd be curious, what does sponsorship mean to you relative to mentoring?
So they're similar, but I'd say that they typically have similar goals, but the implementations will be different. So mentoring tends to be, I guess, more of a two-way relationship. For the most part, the mentee is getting something out of the mentoring relationship, but oftentimes the mentor is also getting something. They're learning, communication skills, leadership skills. They're paying it forward, whatever the case is. Maybe they're getting some perspective in their work as well.
Yeah.
So it's a bilateral, and it's usually someone giving you advice or challenging you to take on a role or take on a task that maybe the mentee might not necessarily initially volunteer for. And a sponsoring relationship, and the goal of the mentoring relationship is to, support people in their careers, Sponsorship relationships are similar. The goal is to enable people to advance in their careers. But the key difference is that sponsors tend to advocate for you when you're not in the room.
Right.
So sponsors tend to be, and as a result, sponsors tend to be more senior individuals. So really people who have to sit at the table, who have a lot of influence, a lot of decision-making power. And those relationships are also important, but there's often not a lot that you can do to control that relationship, except show up, be your best self, do good work around them so that they know about you and they keep you in mind. And when there's promotions available or big opportunities available, and you're not privy to those decisions, those sponsors are in the room advocating for you. So those types of relationships tend to be trickier to develop as a result, but both are, I think, equally important over the course of a career.
So how do you approach building those relationships? And to the decision that you've brought to us today, your intentionality when it comes to nurturing close relationships throughout your career. How do you make these decisions? How do you approach this? How do you prevent it from feeling transactional?
Yeah. So I would say in my experience, there's essentially been two ways to build mentoring relationships. A lot of companies or organizations offer kind of more formal mentoring programs where they find, people at certain levels in their career who are willing to mentor people who are maybe in a similar career path, but they're several years behind as far as their journey into their career path. And so if there's an option to opt into those types of programs, I definitely encourage people to do that. And you can find that through, organizations that are devoted to bridging the gender gap or the racial gap or whatever underrepresented minority gap in technology or different fields. Many of them offer those types of programs, or within some companies, they might have some implementation of that type of program. So those are formal mentoring relationships. And I've had a few of those over the course of my career as well. It's really just a matter of opting in. You get paired with someone, you meet with them a certain number of times a month or year, and, you come to them with questions. They give you advice. It's on you to really drive the outcome of that relationship.
My experience with those sort of formal mentoring programs, they've been challenging.
They can be. Yeah.
Like I've struggled to build connection, I suppose, because it's giving me the opportunity to reflect. Because it's not organic.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So I think those programs work well for people who just don't have access otherwise to form those relationships more organically.
Sure.
So it's almost like if you don't have the ability to go to an event or meet someone who knows someone who can connect you with someone who can mentor you, you might be better off just opting into a formal program, and maybe you find someone that you click with.
Yeah.
And even if you don't find someone you click with, usually these mentors, they've also opted into the program. So they're willing to give something back. Maybe the personality might not align with yours, but you might be able to get something out of the first 2 or 3 sessions with them. And if it doesn't work, you can give that feedback to the organizers. Maybe they pair you up with someone else. So that can definitely tend to be a little bit more tricky to be successful. And I've had a few of those formal mentoring relationships myself. They're not likely to be ones that last a long time for that reason. But you can still get something out of it if you were intentional about how you approached it. But as you hinted at, the more informal, organic mentoring relationships tend to be more long-lasting and more successful. And by their very nature, because they're informal, oftentimes you don't even really put a name on that relationship. It just ends up being someone who is maybe 5 or 10 years ahead of you in a similar career, who maybe you met at an event, or you met through a friend, or you met through your manager or coworker. Whatever connection enabled that relationship to be initiated. And then maybe in the course of that initial conversation, you find that you really get along with this person. They seem to have an interest with you. Maybe they say, why don't you put time on my calendar? Let's grab a coffee sometime. So you know that they're interested in continuing that conversation. And then it's on you as the person who's seeking to be mentored to really take that step and set up that coffee, right? And you want to do your research ahead of time, come with a set of questions. If you talked about something in the first conversation, make sure you have some updates to share with them so that that person really knows that you're valuing their time. And then, again, because it's more organic, you can kind of set the cadence of how often you meet, what you talk about, really the depth and the extent of that relationship. So again, as I said, not many people have the access to form those types of relationships, but you can literally find them anywhere, networking events, through work, through a friend, through a colleague, through a classmate who knows someone who is 2 years ahead of them. So they really take many forms, I would say.
When you think about your career so far and how you've been able to build these opportunities for yourself, what advice do you have for people coming up who are joining the field? What do you wish that you'd known back then that you know now?
So I think, there's a few things that come to mind. One is that there's a lot of people who are just figuring it out, just like you. For me in particular, because I studied electrical engineering and I took one programming class in school, and I thought I knew how to code. So, I applied for an internship. I got the internship, and then I showed up on the first day of the job, and I realized I didn't actually know anything. My very basic introduction to programming class surely did not cover what it required to build a world-class, real-world application. And that was a summer internship. So, there's a lot of hand-holding, there's a lot of support. It's 3 months, you go back to school. And then when I started full-time a year or 2 later, I think this first maybe 6 months to a year, I really had a lot of doubt about whether or not this was really the career for me, because I felt that I struggled quite a bit. I knew the problem that I wanted to solve, and I could describe how to solve it, but I didn't have the tools, the technical tools to write the code to solve the problem. I didn't have the technical tools to even look up, online how to write the code. And so I had a lot of doubt in the beginning about whether or not this was really the career for me. And it just took a lot of practice, a lot of conversations with other people where you realize that other people have similar versions of the same problem. And, now several years later, I'm obviously still in this field. So I figured something out along the way. But I think there's a lot of people who in the early days are just not quite sure if this is for them because it doesn't feel as easy as maybe they thought it would be. So I'd say to people like that, definitely stick through it. Leverage the resources that you have around you. That can be people, that can be books, that can be online resources, mentors if you can find them. And if you're genuinely interested in whatever that field is, I think you probably hit that sweet spot where everything starts to really click. And then the second is to really take the time to build relationships. I think that's the whole reason we're here is you just never really know. It's hard to predict going forward which relationship is going to pay off. And so it's hard to approach every relationship, every person that you meet from that transactional standpoint because, you don't know if this is the person who's going to give you your next job or who's going to connect you with the next opportunity. And nobody really wants to be in a well, maybe some people want to be, but I think probably most people don't really want to be in a transactional relationship. Yeah. But, it doesn't hurt to build your network, to know as many people as you can in your field, in your work, not necessarily within your company, also outside of your company where possible, because it could take 5 years or 10 years down the line where one of those relationships could then pay off. So I'd say, kind of get in that habit of meeting people, following up when you meet them, when someone shows an interest, I think can be really valuable.
It's sort of underscoring the importance of relationships. Professional, personal, and in propelling ourselves forward in life as well as through our careers. Relationships also form the basis of organizational culture within different institutions, organizations, so on and so forth. So when you look at different organizational cultures, do you think about those relationships and there's formal structures in organizations, but there's informal relationship structures. How do you think about those kinds of systems within different organizations that you've encountered?
Yeah, I think that I think of organizational culture as being the intentional or unintentional implementation of what a company's leadership or the company as a whole values.
Yeah. Okay.
And so, there are a lot of organizations where they value high collaboration and they design their teams and they design their sub-organizations around enabling and facilitating that. And there's a lot of organizations, and that's great. And there's other organizations that value transparency. And so they set up their meetings or their communication channels to make sure that that's 100% embedded within the culture. There's some organizations that value hierarchical reporting lines for many different reasons.
Sure.
And so they set up, again, meetings, communication channels, the ways of working in that way. So I think for a lot of people as an individual, you might not necessarily know what you are looking for or what you value out of an organization. But when you spend time looking at different types of companies and how they work and how they interact, you can really start to see the differences between what each one values and then maybe find the one that aligns with the way you see the world.
Which is such an important thing to evaluate, have a way to evaluate, especially as you're beginning your career, your mid-career, like what places make sense for you as an individual to thrive within these spaces.
That's right. And, I think as the internet and many different forms of communication online have become more ubiquitous, there's a lot of companies who are sharing that information, publishing it for the public to see.
Right.
So many companies have their value statements written on their websites, or they put it on their job postings, or the recruiter will tell you in the first conversation that you have with them. So where before it might have been hard to really figure out if this company is really going to be a place that I could thrive in, oftentimes now you can pick up pieces and hints of that through so many of the resources that are available, either through the company website, through the way that the leadership interacts and communicate online, through many different online channels, through maybe they have social media, they create videos or they perform at conferences and whatnot. So there's a lot of places where you can kind of pull that information and then see whether there's a fit with, again, how you see the world.
So do you think your gender as a woman has had an impact on how you approach relationship development and your leadership style overall?
I think that working in a field that is so heavily male dominated, it's almost impossible, I think, for me to not exist in a gendered sense, I guess. So, I'm always conscious that, I'm in a minority in many spaces that I'm in, whether it's at a tech conference or whether it's in a team meeting or a leadership team meeting with other senior leaders in the company. And again, for many different reasons. So, I think that a lot of that influences the decisions that I make. I probably would make the same decisions even if I wasn't a woman. But I'm also very conscious that there's probably a lot of relationships that I don't have natural access to by virtue of being a woman, because many of the other colleagues or people at events that I go to just have an easier connection just because they have more things in common. And so for me, I have to be a lot more intentional in pursuing specific relationships in the course of building out my network, whether it's mentoring network or people that I'm going to mentor as well, or just a professional network, just having more colleagues that I know about and that know me. That's something that I definitely have to be more conscious of. And then as far as leadership, I do think so. I think that I think studies, I think there's a lot of research that's shown that women leaders tend to be a lot more empathetic on average, of course, right? Yeah. So this is not to say that they're not. No, everybody's empathy. Definitely. But I think for me as well, there's certain qualities that I bring to every environment that is probably a virtue of my gender. Yeah. And I lean into that, right? Because I know that that's a strength. That's something that I bring to the table that, again, many of the other colleagues that I interact with don't necessarily have that same advantage because they're not women. So yeah, I definitely think so.
And to wrap up our conversation, I'd be very curious. Smart Women, Smart Power. What are your thoughts on power? What does it mean? How do you exercise it? How do you define? How do you think about power?
I think of power as the agency and the autonomy to make decisions that impact your life or your career in whatever context. So, when you have the tools, when you have the resources, when you have the network to take steps to make decisions, to build relationships that can, adjust your career trajectory, that feels very powerful to me.
Yeah. Well, Funmi, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a terrific conversation.
Thank you so much for having me and giving me an excuse to come back to DC.
Come anytime.
Great.